All right, this is a moment of celebration. This is our last review for our last summative. Now, technically you still have more testing to do, but this is our last summative for the course curriculum itself. So summative 11, we're going to only have 2 topics on it, and one is a repeat, and that's the graphing sine and cosine. We've added a couple extra challenges to that section, so everyone's getting a new score because we're going to ask you some new things, and then also trig modeling the story problems where we have to write the model. So now the last thing we talked about when we were graphing is now we have the addition of the plus k at the end of the function. So that's my question, is what does that k do, and why is that different from what we used to do? So k is the vertical shift. So the midline is at y equals k. So whatever this number is, so like up until this past week, we kept putting a 0 for the midline. Well, now everything's been shifted up or down in certain cases. So the maximum, there is a formula for finding the maximum. It's going to be at the line k and then plus the amplitude. Should be the absolute value of a, but whatever. And I don't really use this formula because I just count. So if the amplitude is 3, I just go up 3 and down 3. So therefore the minimum is going to be at the midline minus the amplitude. You do not need to fill in these formulas, but I am going to ask you on the test to explain what k does to the graph, and then I'm going to have you show it. So same as before, how do you calculate the period? The period is 2 pi divided by that b value, which is the number that changes the period. And then to find the quarter points, we still take the entire period length and divide it by 4. So, some of you skipped this on the last test. Don't skip it this time. I want to know what the general shape for sine and cosine look like. Cosine is the one that starts at the maximum. So cosine is going to do this, right? Top to top. And then sine starts in the midline, and then it kind of does this. Comes back to the midline at the end. So where it starts and stops is the same point. Make sure you are expressing that to me when you're giving me a sketch. And then also when you're giving me the full cycles. Now this time, I'm going to ask you to graph 2 complete cycles because that's what I asked you to do on your post-test that we're taking next week. So let's go ahead and get practicing that. So when you find your quarter point, we're just going to have to keep counting for a while. We're going to have to go out to another set of quarter points essentially. So let's talk about amplitude. Amplitude is the absolute value of the number in front of here. So the amplitude's a 1. B value is a 4, which means the period is no longer 2 pi. This period has been changed to pi over 2. And then quarter point, that's where you take the period and you quarter it. So pi over 2, instead of saying divide by 4, let's say that's pi over 2 times 1/4. That's the same thing. So the denominator now becomes an 8. So it's pi over 8. That's what we're going to have to count by. And remember last time some of you had trouble with the counting. If the reduction is the issue you're having, just don't bother reducing it. Now, this graph is a little overambitious. You know what? Why am I doing this? I have that line tool. Let's try that. I don't know if you're going to need the entire length of it to draw 2 cycles. So do what you want to do. But we don't have any vertical shifts on this first question. So I'm not going to think super hard about what these numbers are. This is 0 in the midline. Amplitude of 1, so that's 1 and that's -1. Some of you forgot to label that axes. Please don't forget this time. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to go out 1, 2, 3, 4 quarter points, and then we're going to keep going 1, 2, 3, 4 more. And that'll be the end of our cycle. 2 cycles. So let's count. 1 pi over 8. And then if you want to call this 2 pi over 8, you can. We'll come back and reduce that. 3 pi over 8. And then you can keep this as 4 pi over 8 for now. And then 5 pi over 8. 6 pi over 8, we'll come back, 7 pi over 8, woo, hello, and 8 pi over 8. So I told you on the last test I didn't really care if you came back and reduced. I want you to try to reduce this time, guys. 2 pi over 8, 2/8 is 1/4, right? You can just type the coefficient in your calculator if you're not sure, but it is pi over 4. 4 pi over 8 is pi over 2. 6 pi over 8 is 3 pi over 4. And then 8 pi over 8 is 1 pi. So that makes kind of beautiful sense, right? If the period length is pi over 2, half of a pi, if I'm graphing 2 cycles, that means I need to get out all the way to pi. And then don't forget you are graphing a sine function. So sine begins in the midline, and then it travels to the maximum, and then keeps hitting every line for every other quarter point, or every quarter point after that, and then keep going. So this will be a challenge for Mrs. Abruzzo to actually create a function that somewhat looks like a sine function Oh man, got pointy. That one's too rounded, and strong finish. All right, something like that, guys. So here's your first cycle. Whoops. Oh man. Try again. I erased half my... Oh man. All right. 3 pi over 8. This is pi over 2, right? 4 pi over 8. Okay. Gosh, be golly. All right. Never mind. That's what we're going to have you do. All right. So nothing really too crazy. This next example I'm going to save for you to complete on your own. It's not the first time we've graphed, so if you need some extra practice on graphing, go back and visit the many things I asked you to do for practice that you probably skipped, and try again. All right, apologies for the numbering here, guys. This is supposed to be number 3. I think basically the numbering on the entire test is messed up, so whatever. Or the review. The test is fine. The review is terrible. All right, this one has a k value that's not 0. So the amplitude is a 4. I see that. There is a b value of 1 in there, so the period is not going to change. Still going to be 2 pi. Which means my quarter points, if I divide this by 4, it's going to be pi over 2. So I'm going to count by pi over 2's. And this is a different thing that I'm asking you that I haven't asked you yet on a test. The midline is no longer at 0, it's at -3. So if you just want to put -3, that's fine. I know what you mean, but it's technically at y equals -3, which I'm going to graph, even though it looks like usually we call this 0. If I label it -3, then it's -3, like it's whatever I label it. Now for the maximum and minimum, because I'm not a huge fan of formulas, especially if I don't really need to use them, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to draw lines in, and then I'm going to label, and I'm going to count. So if amplitude is 4, if I travel up 4 units from -3, that brings me to a 1. Now the way you can find that is you take -3 and then you add 4. So y equals 1. For the minimum, I travel down 4 units and get to -7. So for the formula, that's -3. Yeah, -3 minus 4, which brings me to y equals -7. I don't really care to memorize formulas if I don't need to, so I often don't. All right, this is 0, and we're going to count out. Now it just says 1 cycle this time because I've given you the torture of graphing 2 cycles on the previous question on the test. I'm only going to make you do 1 cycle here. All right, so we have pi over 2, 2 pi over 2, which is pi, 3 pi over 2, and 4 pi over 2, which is 2 pi. And don't fail me now, guys. This is a cosine graph. Cosine starts at the maximum, and then it keeps traveling. So, as promised, I know we did that worksheet for practice the other day, last week actually, and it already had the graph all filled out, and that kind of gave us some challenges where we had to write the ordered pairs off to the side. I'm not going to do that to you on the test, so you're in control of your axes. As long as you label them appropriately, I'm good. Alright, I'm going to leave that one for you to try on your own, and again, we're just graphing 1 cycle of the ones that are vertically shifted. So, since you're watching the video, on your own free time, I'm going to give you a little insight here. These formulas are given to you on the test. They're at the top of the section. So you don't have to do any memorizing of these formulas, but you totally have to memorize how to use them. So calculating the b value, which is what we're doing, we're building the trig model, so we're going to have to find b to place it into the formula. Remember the formula, general formula, is a times sine or cosine. I'm just going to use sine for now. And then b times theta, and then plus k. Those are the formula basics that we're going to be using here. So I need to figure out a and b and k. And once I know those 3 things, I can go ahead and give the formula. So the formula for b is 2 pi divided by the period, or sometimes I give you frequency in a question. So it's 2 pi times the frequency. Again, you don't need to memorize it for this test. I will tell you, however, this you're going to have memorized when you take your post-test next week. This is not given to you, and you do need it. The period is the reciprocal of the frequency, and another way to figure that out is to take 2 pi and divide by b. We really don't use this formula much when we're building models because, again, I want b. The frequency is therefore 1 over period. They're inverses of each other, if you want to think of it that way, inverse numbers. And b divided by 2 pi is how you could find frequency if I asked for it. I'm not going to on the test. The a value for your formula is your maximum minus your minimum divided by 2. So that's half the range is what you're finding. So if the max and midlines, like if this is a 10 and this is a 2, if you find the difference between them, that's the range. But then if you cut it in half, then you know how big half the range is, which is the amplitude. Now the midline, however, is finding that middle line. So to find the middle of something, you add them together and divide by 2. So I always think of it as max plus min divided by 2. Order doesn't matter, of course, because you're adding. Again, these formulas are given to you. Because these problems are challenging enough on their own, we don't need to up the ante by giving you horrible things with no formulas. Okay, here we go. This is really just for your benefit, but it's also for mine. So if you have a misconception over here and you transfer it over here properly, I can give you a little better score. So even though I know you guys don't like graphing this all the time, you're just going to give yourself a little sketch with whatever you could figure out. So knowing what we know about trig models, we know we're going to have something like going on like this, right? Oops, it'd help if these were straight lines though. Let's try that again. Ah, there we go. All right, so, oh geez, that didn't help. Okay, let's read the clues here. High tide, low tide questions are going to be our sine functions, and they're going to give me a clue about high tide and when it occurred, and then they're going to give me a clue about low tide and when it occurred. Now time is going to go on this axis, but time has to be measured in hours for this problem, so it's always smart to start this at 0, and it's going to tell you start at hours since midnight, so you got to think about army time. Midnight is 0 o'clock, or 100 hours, or whatever they call it in the army. So 0, I don't know, I'm clearly not in the army. Alright, so if I think about the clues that they're giving me a 6 a.m. clue, and then if I kind of follow that pattern, these are the quarter points. They kind of told you the quarter point's going to be 6. So 6 hours later, and then 6 more hours would be 12, and then 6 more hours is going to be, I'm going to call it 18, which is 6 p.m., right? That's army time for 1800 hours, because it's 6 hours after noon. And then one more, because quarter point's got to go out to the 4th point, that's 24. So that is going to be the quarter point axes label for our one full period, and it does say high tide is 6 a.m. and then low tide is 6 p.m. So if I kind of use my imagination here, I definitely see a sine function coming up that ends right there. The reason that clue is so important to us is because if you start at 0 hours and the cycle ends at 24 hours, you just found the period. The period is 24 hours. It is not always the same period though, so every problem differs a little bit, so be careful. Now there's another clue they gave me about how vertically high, low, and high tide were. So high tide is 15 feet high, and low tide is 3 feet. So I have to somehow figure out this number, because this number here is k, and that's the midline, right? So if we add them together, k is 3 plus 15, doesn't matter the order, and divide by 2, so you're averaging those together, right? 3 plus 15 in parentheses, that's 18 divided by 2, so that's 9. Make sure you put that in the right part of the formula, though. That's this guy right here. And then amplitude, excuse me for coughing into the microphone. Amplitude is the power of the wave, so it goes from 9 up to 15, or you can measure it from 9 down to 3, because they should be the same. And actually, I stop and make sure it's symmetrical before I move on. That's 6 units up and 6 units down. So 6 is our amplitude. So the only thing we have left to figure out is b. So the formula for b that I like to use is 2 pi divided by the period. Well, you just found the period. It's 24. So 2 pi divided by 24, and reduce this as much as you can. 2 over 24 is 1 over 12, and then leave the pi. So 1 pi over 12 is the b value that goes right here. And I need you to leave it in terms of pi so that it's exact. Isn't that lovely? All right, I gave you like a bunch of examples of these questions to practice, just because this is your only shot at getting a good score without doing retakes, so we want to make sure we get a good score. This clue's about a Ferris wheel, and it has a diameter of 62 feet. We'll come back to that in a moment. It operates at a speed of 5 revolutions per minute. That is frequency. When they tell you how many revolutions in a time, that's frequency, so I'm going to kind of jot that down somewhere. Frequency equals 5. That also tells me something about period is 1/5, but you know, who cares about that? Because I don't really care about the period. What I care about is the b value. So if you'd like, we can go ahead and calculate that now. The formula for b, it is 2 pi divided by period, but it's also 2 pi times the frequency. This is my favorite question because I think the math is easier. So 2 pi times the frequency would be 10 pi. So this is going to go right there. All right. They didn't really tell me much other than, well, they told me everything I need to know. Again, this sketch is for you and me. It's not really necessary for the question. Some kids can figure out the answers, but not many. All right, the bottom of the car is 4 feet above the ground. Clearly, because you're not going to like start on the ground. You'd be scraping everyone's feet off. All right, and then this clue's weird. The diameter of the wheel is 62 feet. So if you're at the bottom of the wheel and then I'm at the top of the wheel, we are literally 62 feet apart from each other. So we have to think about this entire range as being 62. So if I start at 4 and I add 62 to it, this top line here is a 66, which means the middle is 66 plus 4 divided by 2. I always find the midline first, the k. So that is 70, so 35. So this line here is 35. And then I'm going to double check that the amplitude is appropriate. So how far away is 35 to 66? And it better be the same thing as 35 to 4. Well, clearly that's a 31. And then let's see if that makes sense. Is that also a 31? Yep. So this 31 is my amplitude. And it does say when time is 0, your height is 66. Well, that was a dead giveaway, wasn't it? So that tells you where the max line was. I should have kept reading. And a graph that starts here and ends, whoops, here is going to be cosine. So they already gave me that, and it has a positive amplitude value because it starts at the top. We just found out that the amplitude is 31. This question, a lot of kids put the 31 and the 35 in the wrong spot, which is the most common mistake, and please be careful because that is a conceptual mistake. Make sure you're looking at the picture, even though the picture wasn't necessary to get the correct answer. Man, I think it helps like a lot. So here we have another one of these big wheels. This time it's a paddle boat wheel. So we have another clue about the wheel's diameter as being 33 feet. Revolving 18 times per minute, that's frequency, which I did tell you, or no I didn't this time, but it is frequency. So that's going to help us calculate the b value. The b value is 2 pi times frequency. So 2 pi times 18 is going to be 36 pi. I'm going to go ahead and throw that in the formula now. And then, starting at the very top, write a model for the height, blah, 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 and then there's this little clue here. Assume the paddle is 3 feet below the water surface, because, you know, wheels in a boat, paddle wheels, they have to be underwater in order to get some drag so they can actually make the boat go. So, it doesn't say I have to graph anything, but man, does it help. Let's see why. Here we go. Line, line, and this line right here, this is the one everyone messes up. It's below the water surface, so it's -3. And then the entire amplitude is the diameter of the wheel, which is 33 feet. So if you go up 33 feet, you're up at positive 30 now. And then I'm going to need to find the midline. So the midline is 30 plus -3, cut in half, and this is a decimal, right? So 27 halves is, oh, what is that, 13.5? So that's the midline. I'm going to go sneak it in the formula before I forget where to put that. And then amplitude. This is the one that can be tricky if you don't double check, right? It's got to be the same size from middle to top, middle to bottom. So 13.5 up to 30 is, oh man, or I should be able to do that, shouldn't I? 16.5? And then 13.5 down to -3 is still 16.5. So we have our amplitude, and it does say somewhere here that it starts at the top. So your amplitude number in your formula is positive 16.5, and I think we're good. Don't worry about me throwing a sneaky one on your test where it starts at the bottom all of a sudden. I'm not going to do that to you, so do not panic. Let's do one more high tide, low tide question. All right, high tide, low tide. Let's get our lines in. Excuse me again. So high tide is 12 feet, and then low tide is 2 feet. You know what? Let's go ahead and find the middle while we're at it. Midline is 2 plus 12 cut in half. So think about, I hate memorizing formulas just for memorizing them. You're finding the average line. So you add them up and divide by 2. So 14 divided by 2 is 7. And then I'm going to triple check that everything is, that is the middle in fact. So it should be the same distance from everywhere. So this 5 units up and 5 units down. So make sure they go in the right spot. The midline is 7. So that's this guy. The amplitude is 5, and I just told you it's not going to be negative for our test, so don't worry about it reflecting. All right, now for the time. Quarter points. They did give them to you, kind of. Half of them at least. It says high tide occurs at 4 a.m. So this is midnight. This is 0, 100 hours, and then 4 a.m. Then if I continue on with that same pattern, this will be 8, this will be 12 noon, and then you can't call this 4 p.m., you have to call it 16, because it's measuring how many hours have elapsed since midnight. So high tide here, low tide here, and then we get something that looks like this, but who cares about the graph? Because all I need this picture for, besides filling in the amplitude in K, I needed to figure out the period length. So the full cycle is 16 hours long, which means I get to use that to find B. B is 2 pi divided by period. So this is the one where the fraction has to reduce a little bit. So 2 pi divided by 16, the 2 over 16 cancels to 1 over 8, so it's 1 pi over 8. So in these high tide, low tide questions, the B values are going to be funky little pi fractions. On the Ferris wheel or paddle boat questions, they're still going to have pi in them for B. We talked about that briefly in another lesson where, because of real life, you don't measure time in terms of pi hours. That's weird. So the B value has to have a pi component to it, so that way the pi in the formula will cancel out and your time measurements make more sense for real life. You can say, the period is 16 hours, or the period is 4 minutes. You don't want to say, it's 3 pi over 4 minutes. That's weird. So, all right, that's our last lesson, guys. That's well, not even our last lesson, but it's our last test, so that's something. And actually, that's not true either. It's not your last test. Okay, it's your last official summative before the other many, many, many tests we're going to take here at the end. All right, good luck.